Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event organized by the Center for Middle East Studies. Today's book talk will be on the Kurdish nobility in the Ottoman Empire. My name is Nadia Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown. Professor Nilay Özok-Gündoğan will be in conversation with my colleague Beshara Doumani. So let me introduce both of you. So Professor Nilay Özok-Gündoğan is an assistant professor of Ottoman and Middle East history at Florida State University. Her research centers on the question of modern state-making, property regimes, and intercommunal conflict and coexistence in the borderlands of modern empires. She also writes about the question of methodology in Kurdish studies. Her publications appeared in Jadaliya, Journal of Social History, International Journal of Middle East Studies, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and in various other edited volumes. Welcome, Nilay. We're very happy that you could join us today. And Nilay will be in conversation with Professor Beshara Doumani, who is the Mahmoud Darwish Chair for Palestinian Studies at Brown University and former president of Birzeit University in Palestine. His research focuses on the social histories of peoples, places, and time periods marginalized by mainstream scholarship on the early modern and modern Middle East. Professor Beshara also writes on academic freedom and the Palestinian condition. He is currently working on a history of the Palestinians through the social life of stone. Welcome, Beshara. So let me tell you about the structure of today's event. Professor Gundogan is going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then Professor Doumani will be in conversation with her. I invite you to put your questions or comments in the Q&A function, and we will have time to address those. So over to you, Nilay.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for putting this together, and thank you to Barbara, Lisa, and Center for Middle East Studies. And many thanks to Beshara for serving as the discussant. I'm really excited. Let me share my screen with you. Okay, all right. Always there's something with the PowerPoint. So I want to begin with a scene from the 16th century, depicting a Kurdish ruler having an audience with Sultan Selim I during his Eastern campaign. Soon after, Ketuda Bey appeared at the door. He said, "It is the Hakim of Palu, Cemşit Bey." Cemşit Bey looked to be in his 50s. He was very tall and had a dark complexion. He was wearing an Abani turban and embroidered cardigan. There was an empty scabbard for a dagger on his belt wrapped around his waist. His dagger was taken before he entered. It was forbidden to appear before the Sultan with a weapon. Cemşit Bey was one of the Kurdish begs who declared their loyalty to the Sultan during the Chaldiran battle, where he distinguished himself and he showed significant achievements, and he put in effort and had a share in victory. Cemşit Beg stopped 3 feet from the throne, put his hand on his chest, and greeted the Sultan. The Sultan responded, "Alaykum as-salam, Cemşit Beg. It makes us pleased to see you among us. How are our brethren along the borderlines? I represent the Sunni Kurdish begs in your presence. They chose me from among themselves. They asked me to convey their loyalty." He took out a kozak from his belt and passed it to Sultan. "Here is the deed of alliance. It is sealed by 25 Kurdish begs." Sultan Selim I opened the kozak, took the paper out, and read it carefully. Kurdish begs were proclaiming their unconditional acceptance of the sublime and just rule of the Ottomans. There were 25 seals on the bottom of the page. The Sultan's face lightened up. He said, "Thanks. God bless you all. We are appointing these begs whose names appear here as the emirs of the places where they are situated. Praise be." Cemşit Beg reached out to Sultan to kiss his hand. Yavuz stood up hastily, grabbed Cemşit Beg from his shoulders, and pulled him towards himself. We like hugging our brethren, brother Cemşit. Cemşit Beg was to Palo nobility what Osman Gazi was to Ottomans, a ruler of the Palo Emirate within the Ottoman realm. Cemşit Beg's ancestors, the Mirdasi Begs, predated Ottoman rule in the area. According to Sharaf Khan, Sharafname, 16th century, arguably the most comprehensive historical account of the Kurdish noble families, Mirdasi Begs led an emirate centered on neighboring Eil around the 11th century. The Palo Emirate was established by one branch of this family based in Bagan Castle near Palu. It's a fortress town. When his uncle died without an heir, Cemşit Beg became the leader of the emirate and brought it under Ottoman suzerainty in the early 16th century. So what you're seeing on the screen is a book, and the scene is quoted from this book, Mısır'a Doğru, Seferi Hümayun, a novel that came out in 2010 by Yavuz Bahadıroğlu, a novelist and columnist known for his Islamist conservative bent in Turkey. The last volume of a trilogy narrating Sultan Selim's first reign, the book covers his eastern campaigns. Bahadıroğlu's dramatic description of Cemşit Beg's encounter with the Sultan obviously employs several leaps of imagination. It would be difficult to know what Cemşit Beg actually wore or how he comported himself or the Sultan's exact words. But two things in this scene are true. One is that Cemşit Beg did have an audience with Sultan Selim I in Karaman when the latter was on his way to Tabriz. And as the scene implies, Cemşit Beg's military achievements during the Ottoman-Safavid wars made him stand out among the Kurdish Begs. He defended the Palu fortress from Safavid forces and was one of the Kurdish Begs who accepted Ottoman suzerainty as a result of the ardent diplomacy of the Ottoman envoy İdris-i Bitlisi. This made Cemşit Beg the architect of the Palu Begs' incorporation into the Ottoman Kurdish nobility in the 16th century with a hereditary privileged status in the Ottoman world. His descendants maintained their hereditary rule over Palu until the mid-19th century, more than three centuries. Şerefname, the 16th century account of the Kurdish ruling households, includes a story about Cemşit Beg from before he ruled the Palo Emirate, when he served Halid Beg of the Pazuki Emirate, another Kurdish emirate in the region. As the story goes, Cemşit Beg, who was known as Kara Cemşit at the time, was hunting with his master, and Halid Beg's bird soared high, staying in the sky longer than usual. When it finally came back, it landed on Cemşit Beg's head, which witnesses understood to mean that he would someday have a magnificent state. A few days later, Cemşit Beg's uncle, the emirate's ruler, died without an heir, and Cemşit Beg succeeded him. So why am I talking about this? Because this is the foundation myth of the Palo Emirate under the charismatic leadership of Cemşit Beg, reminiscent of the Ottoman Empire's foundation myth under Osman Gazi. Cemşit Beg did not lead a world empire that lasted 6 centuries, but he proved his leadership, valor, and diplomatic skills in the context of the Ottoman-Safavid wars, and he solidified the rule of his noble family, who maintained their hereditary rights for the next 3 centuries. So I want to fast forward to 1848. I will try to animate this narrative with a little bit of, with some vignettes. In the last day of August 1848, the inhabitants of Weshin, a village of Palu, nestled in a secluded valley on the banks of the eastern Euphrates, woke early. The men met at the village mosque to perform the pre-sunrise prayer marking the beginning of Ramadan. Just before the prayer began, they heard the sound of gunfire. As the noise approached, the prayer-goers saw that it was being made by Abdullah Beg, the Hakim, or the ruler of the Palo Emirate, and at least 600 armed men. They were coming to collect 1.5 tons of clarified butter from the villagers in payment for 4 years of back taxes owed to Abdullah Beg. The villagers responded by opening fire. Ramazan turned bloody with 3 villagers dead and 4 wounded. The despairing villagers then fled to the surrounding hills. The next day, Abdullah Beg came back with his men and set the village on fire, burning 65 houses and buildings to the ground, along with stored grain, animals, and their fodder, poplar trees and vineyards. You know, I have all the details because I read hundreds of documents about this particular incident. And I want to tell you why this, you know, seemingly micro incident is so important. On the surface, it's just, you know, looks like just among many other conflicts about agrarian surplus extraction all around the world. But what neither Abdullah Bey nor the villagers knew was that the incident would trigger a series of events that would break up the Palu Beg's hereditary rule in the Ottoman Empire. Abdullah Beg was a descendant of Cemşit Bey, you know, opening vignette. Within a year, this violent encounter would cost Abdullah Bey his position as hakim, his land holdings, and when the Ottoman state exiled him to Tekirdağ in Rumelia, his bond with his homeland. And with the end of Abdullah Beg's career came the end of the Beg's hereditary rule in Palu. Kurdish Emirates and the elite families have been the cornerstones of the popular and academic historical renditions of Kurds and Kurdistan. Many of us know about the other Kurdish Emirates, the Baban Emirate, Botan Emirate, or the Soran Emirate. We don't know that much about the Palo Emirate because Palo Emirate was geographically much smaller and politically less significant than the previously mentioned emirates. The Palu Begs did not respond to the Ottoman state's mid-19th century centralization policies with large-scale uprisings. It's true that Abdullah Beg was also exiled, but the rest of his family stayed in Palu and continued to claim rulership of the emirate for several decades after Abdullah Beg's exile. So from the day they acknowledged the Ottoman suzerainty until after the empire's disintegration, the Palu Begs maintained their identity as a noble family, the belief that they stood above other men. This sense of noble past predated the Ottoman suzerainty, like I said before, but the Begs justified their noble privileges by referring to the imperial decrees granted by the Ottoman sultans. So up to this point, I told you the beginning of a story, how the Palu elites were formed, and the end of it, you know, the end of their hereditary noble privileges. In the book, I present actually the first comprehensive account of the transformation and eventual disappearance of a Kurdish elite family, a Kurdish noble family's hereditary privileges in the Ottoman Empire. By examining the noble position of the Palu Begs, in the book, I kind of challenge one of the foundational assumptions of Ottoman historical writing, that the Ottoman state categorically rejected hereditary nobility. So this view, according to this conventional view, the Ottoman political administrative system was inherently inimical to hereditary nobilities. The system was meritocratic, the ruling elites were the slaves of the sultans, and there was no way of transferring property across generations since the Ottoman state confiscated property. So there are a few assumptions here about the nature of the Ottoman state, the difference between the Ottomans and the European states, many others, which I believe we will be discussing in the Q&A and the discussion session. But what I want to emphasize here is that when I look at the Palu nobility, I see a persistent, sense of noble identity and the privileges granted to them by the Ottoman Sultan, fiscal, military, and administrative privileges, which recognized them as a noble family and which gave them a significant degree of autonomy in their respected realm of territories. So in order to achieve that, I kind of try to go beyond this notion of nobility and notion of autonomy as they are defined on paper. So I look at how privilege was defined and how it was implemented on the ground from the 16th century through the late 19th century. So the book centers one elite family at its narrative, but then it talks about what its implications are for understanding the history of Kurds and Kurdistan, and also for the history of the larger segments of the Kurdish society from around the 16th through the 19th century. So with this, I try to address a couple of historiographical, narratives established in Kurdish historiography, Ottoman historiography, and larger Middle East historiography. But ultimately, I am a social historian. Even though I am focusing on elite family, like a noble family, the Palu elites, I look at how different segments of the Palu society, including moneylenders, sharecroppers, middle peasantry, and different segments of the society involved in this process of the confiscation of the Palo elite's lands in the 19th century. Thank you.
That's great. I'm on, right? Thank you very much. Thank you, Nilay. Let me begin by saying that most of us are not well at this historic moment of genocide, displacement, and erasure of the Palestinians. I'd like to recognize that at the outset. Now, the story of the specific lineage of a Kurdish hereditary noble family based in the now largely forgotten and utterly transformed city of Palu from the 16th and 19th centuries would seem completely distant from what matters at the moment. But things are not what they seem. Professor Nilay Özok-Gündoğan's deeply researched book has many large intellectual and political stakes. And I want to say that I very much enjoyed reading this book, not only as a work of history of a particular group, place, and time that have been marginalized, and which give us a new perspective on the history of the Ottoman Empire and on Kurdish history, but also for being a book that is subversive in the good sense of the word. Of the historiography of the Ottoman Empire, of the transition from early modern to modern, both in terms of socioeconomic transformation and modes of governance, and on challenging Kurdish nationalist constructions of the past, which I must say is not an easy thing to do. It's perhaps easy for some people who already have a state and a nation to look back and be critical of how the nation state has constructed their past, and in order for them to be good citizens of that state. But when you are a member of a stateless people who are still struggling and who are still facing structural violence that spans generations, it takes courage and I think a great deal of commitment to be able to look back and say, well, the past isn't like what the nationalist movements say it is. And we have to liberate the potential of this messiness and complexity of that past in order to see a better future. And I think that's what this book does, and that's why its intellectual and political stakes for me are very important, and I want to thank you very much for writing this book. And I want to add selfishly, in the sense that I'm also a social historian who writes about the periphery's periphery, so to speak, that we are witnessing here not just a good book of social history, we're witnessing a kind of a new social history that has been on the rise for the past 10, 15 years. I think as historians absorbed and understood the cultural turn or the linguistic turn and tried to come up with better questions about the past. And I think this book benefits from that kind of deep engagement with both the material and the discursive. Nevertheless, having said that, I think it was very important that this book really focus on relationships between people about land as a central theme in understanding the 3 centuries that led up to the demise of not only the Palu nobility, but also the beginning and exacerbation of communal violence with Armenian peasants and others, as well as the rise of nationalist irredentist movements. And I think this book gives us a much better understanding of these issues than anything we really have seen before. I would like to begin by asking maybe 2 or 3 questions about the conceptual vocabulary that you're using, and then move on to some of these larger stakes quickly. Let's begin with the title of the book, so nobility. So coming from a long tradition of historiography of the Arab lands under Ottoman rule, as I do, we talk a lot about notables. We don't talk about nobility. And I think for the audience, perhaps it would be a good place to start. What is the difference between notables and nobility, and why is that even important? Because I'm sure a lot of people have not been thinking about the word nobility when it comes to the Ottoman Empire.
Okay, thank you so much, Beshara, for your thoughtful comments about the book. Yes, notable versus nobility is one of the core discussions that I have especially in the introduction, because of course, Albert Hourani's work, right, where he defines elites, mostly referring to Arab elites, by talking about their particular type of political power they have, building connections between the larger, populations in the provinces and the imperial center. And even though he is talking about a particular form of political power, he also talks about where that power comes from. And so he indicates a couple of different groups with maybe religious authority, economic power, and whatnot. So Hourani's work about notables, the concept itself was taken and really thoroughly examined in Ottoman historiography, from the Balkans to the Arab provinces. Different, historians of different time periods and regions talked about notables in so many different ways. But when it comes to the Kurdish, and actually Kurdish historians also talked about the Kurdish elites as notables. But what I think is really key to understanding the Kurdish Emirates and the Kurdish elite families, ruling households, is the hereditary character of their rule. So the hereditary character of their rule implies a couple of different things. One is that this is recognized as such by the Ottoman state at the times of their incorporation into the Ottoman Empire. So from the beginning until the very end, they defined themselves, and they were defined as such by the Ottoman state as an elite group with hereditary rights, privileges, prerogatives, and responsibilities that comes with that. In the notable conceptualization does not always indicate that the rights, positions, wealth, power, economic or political power may or may not have hereditary implications. But in the discussion of the Kurdish nobility, the reason that I use the concept of nobility is because they are defined by virtue of their hereditary position, which implies and actually recognizes in the imperial decrees that their presence, they existed prior to the Ottoman entry in Kurdistan. And the Temlikname, the original decree that is given to us, is actually one of the maybe rare instances in which Ottoman state legally define and accepts hereditary nature of their privileges. And the concept of notable indicates an elite's position and indicates a type of power that comes from certain degrees of economic, cultural, or capital. However, it does not always imply an hereditary character that comes with it. That's why I think it is key to understand these particular Kurdish emirates and the type of position that they have as nobility. I can't hear you. Yeah, you're muted.
Your answer seems to suggest that recognizing the fact that not just notables, but a hereditary nobility existed, challenges the Oriental despotism model of the Ottoman Empire. It challenges the assumption that through the devshirme system or through a variety of other methods, the Ottomans somehow cut out the middleman in the sense of the estate-based nobility along the French model. Mm-hmm. Then you go on to say that actually the Ottoman Empire maybe not so different from what was going on in Europe, that the French model was an ideal model, but there was actually a great deal of differentiation among the understanding of nobility. And the same should be true of the Ottoman Empire. Now, so that's I think, part of a trend in scholarship, a very productive and fruitful trend, which has redefined the criteria for comparative work between empires in the early modern to the modern period. And that's a great way to get at it. But what does it tell us really? And here I would like you to sort of look down instead of up. What does it tell us about what that means in terms of land relations? Just because there was hereditary nobility in Palo, does that mean that relationships to the land differed substantially from areas that didn't have a hereditary nobility? And here, if I may, you talk about the commoditization of land in the 18th century as an important pivot in the relationships between people about land. But that seems to be true, or at least Ottoman historians are fond of arguing that this is true all over the Ottoman Empire. So what difference did hereditary nobility really make on the ground?
Okay, that's actually a wonderful question, especially because land is at the center of my analysis. Like throughout the book, land is the key issue because from the 16th century onwards, like you mentioned, land is defined as mulk, private property, in the original Temlikname granted to the Kurdish beys. What that means here is that, well, there are different configurations of land ownership throughout the empire. So the first thing to emphasize here is that it is really impossible to come up with a generalization when it comes to land ownership, surplus extraction, and power relations revolving around these things. But in the original document in the 1535, land that the Kurdish nobility has is defined as mulk, private property. What it means here is that Kurdish nobles has exclusive control over agrarian surplus. This might or might not be, similar to other examples in and outside of the Arab world. But the significant here is that there is here an overlap between economic control and political control. Economic control means like uninhibited control over surplus extraction, while political control means that there is the Ottoman administrators, military or civilian, have no access to these territories ruled by the Kurdish nobility. So this is like really a very, I'm not going to say unique, but recognizing these two aspects of control over land is important. So when it comes to the second component of your question, which is commercialization, you're absolutely right. In the 18th century, it resembles all the other examples throughout the empire. There is like this big visible trend towards the commodification of land. And this is the first time that the Kurdish nobility, in fact, start to lose their control over land or their hereditary control over land, not as a result of a political process, but as a result of the economic processes that you really refer to. But this difference here is that in the literature, we have this like long established notion of, comes from centralization, decentralization, center versus periphery. We have this established notion that 18th century represents like a relative increase in the power of the political elites throughout the empire. This is not the case for the Kurdish nobility. In Kurdistan, the Kurdish elites, through commodification, they do not actually benefit from this process because there is a parallel political process of the Ottoman elites entering the region and trying to have claims over agrarian surplus. So there are, of course, parallels because we are looking at a pre-capitalist notion of control over lands in the, in different provinces of the empire. But the particular type of power configuration that comes from the hereditary notion of land creates certain degree of uniqueness to Kurdish elites that I don't think exists in like all around the empire in a standard fashion. The question is also about, I guess, labor, right? Because you asked about the bottom-up aspect of it. What does it mean what does having hereditary control over land mean for those who till the land, right? In the Kurdish society, I guess that it really takes, we will need more time to, you know, understand what that means. In my particular case, within Palu, I can't really say what labor forms looked like prior to the 18th century. But in the 18th century, as the Kurdish nobility kind of lost their control over land through economic processes with commodification, that also means like a parallel notion of emerging notion of sharecropper population inland in the Kurdish areas. So this has so many implications in terms of understanding Kurdish history, because we almost always think that Kurdish system, like Kurdish sociopolitical organization, is tribal, and we don't say anything beyond that. But what we see here is that the particular configuration of labor inland that is based on the commodification of land and the resultant, you know, labor form, sharecropping. And in the book, I elaborate on that, what it turns in the 19th century, how it changes in the late 19th century as far as intercommunal relations are concerned. So you know, circling back to your original question, yes, there are definitely similarities, but there are also so many differences, which really comes from the original form of the agreement between the Ottoman state and the Kurdish elites, which gives them really unlimited control over land and its surplus.
Thank you. Can we put some flesh on the bones and make it a little bit less abstract? If you can just give us an idea, you said about the political economy and the social formations within the kind of ecology of Palu.
Mm-hmm.
You said it's a place that's defined by the river, the forest, and the mines.
Yes.
So please, you know, let us know what does that mean exactly? And we have to take a snapshot of the social formation in this town, or of what, 45,000 or so, and the 300 villages or so that were attached to it. Who lived there? What did they do? How did they live in terms of, how did they change, I meant to say, in terms of their lives? And situate specifically the Armenian population within that.
Okay, for sure, yes. Palu's population consists of Kurdish, both Zaza and Kurmanji, and Armenian population to a great extent. We would see that, like I mentioned, river, like you said, as one of the important components of the social ecology of the town of Palu, because it kind of like in the northern part of the river, we have like the majority Armenian population living, and the majority of the sharecropping population consists of Armenians in the 19th century. So,
was this land irrigated or is it rain-fed?
Oh, it is actually irrigated.
So it's a deeply entrenched sharecropping system.
Deeply entrenched sharecropping system, but I think that becomes more pertinent in and around like late 18th century in terms of
Excuse me to interrupt, but Nilay, would you mind stop sharing your slides? That would be great. Thank you. Thanks.
Yes. And as far as the other component I mentioned, which you refer to, is mines and forestry, right? So the Armenians, of course, like we are looking at an ethnoreligiously like mixed population, and that is really not unusual looking at Kurdistan. It is really typically the case almost everywhere. But then the majority of the sharecropping population consists of the Armenians. And with the confiscation of the Kurdish beys' lands, like some of the Armenian sharecroppers and wealthy sectors, they start to claim the lands of the Kurdish nobility. But the other component, forest and mines, that is also important, because like through the analysis of mining and land and, you know, where labor stands in this dynamic, we see that different segments of the Kurdish and Armenian population, they become a part of the larger process of the confiscation of the Kurdish beys' lands, and it changes the notion of the nobility. But going back to your original question, in the 18th century, what changes the power of the, or the nature of the power of the Kurdish nobility is not really anything, you know, coming from bottom up. It is mostly the proximity of Palu to the Keban-Argani mine region. And Keban-Argani mine region is literally the central mining area of the empire in the 18th century. And in order to administer these mines, the Ottoman administrators, they established a specific mine administration and connect the surrounding villages, Armenian or Kurdish villages, to this like mine administration and give it a certain degree of autonomy or serbestiyet for the administration of the mines. Why is this important for understanding the region and the social ecology of the region? Is because these villages basically have to provide the basic needs of these mines. And it includes charcoal, it includes food and everything else. So the Kurdish villages, surrounding the mines, they send charcoal through the rivers to the mines. And this changes the relationship between the Kurdish nobility and the Ottoman administrators. But it also changes the social ecology of the region because charcoal is, of course, it is man-made, right? And so the production of excessive amounts of charcoal for the needs of the mines results in excessive deforestation of the region. I mean, my book cover is made by a Kurdish artist, Nurettin Arkan, and he listened to me to paint that. And in that, one of the things that I really wished him to emphasize was the bare mountains. And the bare mountains, the reason for that is mostly because the sudden and excessive deforestation that came with the existence of mines and the mine-related responsibilities. So, sorry, I'm not giving you a coherent answer here, but it is just like I want to animate this like socioeconomic landscape and the social ecology of the region, referring to the mines, rivers, and agrarian production.
No, I mean, actually, this is exactly right, because we have here the possibility of an argument about the history of capitalism, about industrial production, about the provision of labor for these mines, plus certain supplies. And as you mentioned before, these were ferried through the river on what they call keleks, which are often goat skins that are inflated under wood, and they carry material. And this is something that goes well into Iraq. In fact, the great Hanna Batatu, in his history of the Ba'ath Party, made a very big deal about the capitalist transformation in the 18th and 19th century of the region where Saddam Hussein came from and what led to his rise of that. So I can see all the echoes of that here in the book. And I don't know if one of my students, Anil Laskin, is watching or not, but I think he's especially interested in the question of mines. And I hope he can intervene if he's watching. So what role did these hereditary noble family play in the provision of labor for these mines?
So it's just like, I mean, mine labor, which is the second project. I always say this: don't make me talk about mines because I will talk for the next 3 hours. So it's only one chapter in this book, but so the mine labor, I think we have to kind of like qualify that, because there is the labor within the mines, like the mining, exclusively mining job, but there's all sorts of other jobs outside of the mines. So the local population were mostly responsible for the type of jobs that were done outside of the mines, provisioning of wood, provisioning of charcoal, provisioning of food, animals to carry all this. So the position of the Kurdish nobility was basically make sure that people do the job. So these villages have kind of like the surrounding villages that are administratively attached to the mine administration. If they're close enough, or if they're able to provide these provisions, like the needs of the mines, sure enough, they would do that. And the Kurdish nobility would be the ones to supervise how that job is done. If they're not, then they are given like fiscal and tax privileges. So the Kurdish nobility, basically, one example would be the lumberjacks, right? Those who cut the wood. So the Kurdish nobility would recruit them and kind of like make the fiscal arrangements with them, how much money they would be paid and how much labor they have to put in. And then they were also responsible for providing the security of lumberjacks, because like they keep going out to the forest, but then wood does not reproduce itself, it can't catch up with the suddenness of the destruction. So the forest progressively becomes further and further. And so it is the job of the Kurdish nobility to bring their military power, armed men, to make sure that the security of them is survived. But it concerns other things, for instance, meat market. It is curious, right? It sounds really interesting. How is meat market connected to mining and charcoal? But it's connected because keleks, like you said, they consist of animal skin. And then any scarcity in the animal market actually changed the accessibility or availability of keleks. So it kind of like shapes or affects the transportation of charcoal to the mines. And then when that happens, it is basically the job of the Kurdish nobility to make sure that animal market is, taken care of. So there is enough animal skins to make sure that the keleks are, constructed. So they have basically, yes, their job is kind of like similar to all the other elites in a pre-nation state context in terms of becoming the kind of like the intermediaries that make sure that the job is done, both in economic and political and military sense of the term. But then this, within the specific case of the Kurdish nobles, kind of like backfires because they start to lose their privileges because of the emergence of a very strong political personality in the region, which is the mine superintendent.
We have a number of audience questions, so if you don't mind, I'd like to turn towards those. The first question is by Arif Erbil. Thank you so much for this great talk. Looking forward to reading the book as well. I've recently had a chance to listen to Youssef Ben Ismail's work on the transformation of the relationship with Tunis and Algeria due to the French-Ottoman imperial dispute over the sovereign status of these lands based on international law. It was interesting to see how this dispute shaped the status of these autonomous regions in the understanding of Ottoman ruling elites. Have you seen a similar direct relationship with imperial rivalry beside the colonial logic's influence over the Ottomans' understanding of quote-unquote peripheries? So I will ask you to answer this. I have two more questions, actually three more questions. So if you could try to keep it short, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So in the case of Kurdistan, I'm trying to be brief, so excuse me if it is not too brief. But in the case of Kurdistan, of course, Kurdistan is on the border with Safavid, later Qajar, Iranian and the Ottoman state. And the particular region that I am looking at once they came under the Ottoman rule, they progressively lose the potential of being a frontier area between the two empires. I'm specifically talking about this particular emirate. But the other Kurdish emirates closer to the Iranian region, they are key in the context of the Ottoman Safavid imperial rivalry all through the 19th century, all the way until the 19th century. So the policies that the Ottoman states pursue towards this elite group, which are closer to the imperial orbit, both from a political and proximity point of view, is different from their approach to the Kurdish noble families, Kurdish ruling households closer to the border. So when they are basically confiscating the hereditary privileges of my elite group, they are very hesitant to touch those of the ones that are closest to the imperial, like Safavid border, because their loyalties are fluctuating. So the Kurdish nobles around Van and Hakkari, their loyalties are fluctuating because they might or might not at a given time support the Iranians or the Ottomans all through the 19th century. So there is a difference from that point of view. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you. Sirvan Hariri has two questions. Question one, aside from politics, have the Kurdish nobles engaged in any cultural activities according to your findings in the archives you studied? And question two, in their exchange letters, were Kurdish nobles communicating to each other in Kurdish or non-Kurdish languages? Was there any sense of Kurdish language advocacy among Kurdish elites?
Okay, so wonderful. So the cultural activities. So, you know, obviously this is, I haven't studied the cultural aspect of it, but I can give you some hints here, which is about genealogies. You know, I mentioned Sheref Khan, the most important historical account of the Kurdish ruling households. In the 18th century, one of the Palu beys, he commissioned someone to basically translate Sheref Khan from Persian to Ottoman Turkish, because they're an elite family and they're interested in genealogies, and Sheref Khan talks about their ancestors. But when he commissions that translation, he also wants the translator, Shem'i, to basically add one other section about their family's, history to the Sherefname. So that is one example of their, cultural activity that I can name here. Did they have correspondence in Kurdish between themselves? I don't know. I really don't have any account of the correspondence between different elite households in the region that I am looking at. But from the Shemi example here, what I'm seeing here is that reflecting the time period, they were more interested in Persian and Ottoman Turkish as court languages than Kurdish in terms of their articulation. But that's a great question in terms of how they communicated with the other Kurdish elites. And the last one was...
No, I think that you've covered that. You covered all the questions. Thank you. Hülya Rigedarshan is thanking you for the informative presentation. And she says, although I haven't had the chance to read your book yet, I'm eagerly anticipating delving into it soon. I'm curious, why Palu? Why not the other one? Is there any particular reason? And during your research, did you access any newspapers addressing Kurdish nobility and relations with other groups between 1890 to open-ended? Last question, during the conflicts between the central government and Kurdish groups, what were the Armenian reactions? Thank you so much.
Okay. So why Palu? Well, a couple of reasons, but the most important one is that this reflects my overall scholarly agenda of going beyond the historicist accounts of Kurdish history, kind of trying to tell a story of, the dissolution of the Emirates and that linear story going towards Kurdish statelessness. So Palu represents something different. Palu represents an elite family that identified with the Ottomans all the way through, until the end of the empire. So that is, one of the most important reasons for me to show that alternative history, which doesn't fit with the, ethnocentric accounts of this region's history. And the newspapers, I didn't work with the newspapers, but other scholars like Janet Klein, Jean Bajalan, and many others for the later part of the 19th century, they worked on the newspapers. Both imperial and also Kurdish newspapers to talk about Kurdish history. But again, it is interesting, Palu was never that important to feature in any type of newspaper, be it local or imperial, for reasons that I explained previously. Why do I keep forgetting the third question?
I can tell you. So then last question. During the conflicts between the central government and Kurdish groups, what were the Armenian reactions?
Okay, so it's interesting because Armenians, after the lands were confiscated, they are the ones who pursue this consistent agenda from the 1840s onwards to basically establish private land ownership, force the state to kind of confiscate the nobility's privileges over land. And then progressively we see that there are different segments of the Armenian population, they do benefit from this process. They purchase land, and then some of them, after purchasing land, interestingly, they act exactly like the Kurdish nobles in terms of, creating a sharecropping population and, overtaxation and all. But the important point here is that after the confiscation of the Kurdish nobles' beys, Armenians become more and more visible in the historical record because they want to kind of push the state to create a certain degree of law and legality over private land ownership, which would undermine the hereditary rights and privileges of the Kurdish nobility. And the last chapter of the book is actually about 1895 massacres, which I see as a culmination of the processes from the 1840s onwards, revolving around the confiscation of the Kurdish elite's lands and the Armenian population's role in this process.
Thank you, Nilay. If you don't mind, I have a question that is sort of slightly sort of taking us out, focusing specifically on the book, but as you know, I'm sort of interested in Kurdish studies more broadly, and you have mentioned on several occasions in this talk that, you know, this book is also challenging some of the, I guess, so more sort of prevailing narratives around, you know, Kurdish history. So I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on what you see as some of the main challenges of Kurdish studies and how your work is trying to interject and try to make an impact.
Okay. Thank you, Nadia, for that question. Well, it is interesting because I kind of always feel like I have like a divided loyalty and identity as an Ottoman historian, because like what I'm trying to do is kind of like what all like many other Ottoman historians try to do, meaning trying to incorporate a region, a particular group into Ottoman history, like mostly an forgotten group, but not just to have another addition to Ottoman history, but basically to have us reconsider established notions of Ottoman history through the prism of a particular region. Now, that is for me, I think the easier part, because there is an agenda for historical scholarship and historical research, of course, in Ottoman and Middle Eastern studies. But when it comes to Kurdish studies, history is the least popular subject. And I think it is Kurds are not an exception in that respect, because since we are, like Beshara mentioned at the beginning, we are dealing with an immediate situation. Kurdish statelessness creates so much misery, and then so much human rights violations. And Kurdistan, as of now, is a colonized geography. So the foremost challenge for me is that Kurdish studies reproduces this really kind of like historicist notion of the fact that there is no Kurdish history, but only Kurdish present. And it is very common for colonized peoples to focus on their present and go backwards and have a limited understanding of what their past might or might not look like. So for me, the biggest challenge, I'm sorry, I can't give you really like a very sophisticated answer here, is not to find enough interest in Kurdish studies in Kurdish past, because the foremost interest is in the Kurdish present. So historicism, I think, is the biggest problem here. And the present-oriented notions of Kurdish historical past is my biggest challenge as someone who operates in Kurdish studies as well.
Yeah, thank you. We have 5 minutes, so I'm going to leave it to Beshara to ask maybe the last question.
Thank you. So let's take it from there. Why do we need to understand that the past was messy and it's not like nationalists would have us tell it? What is the potential of the story that you told to think differently about the kind of future that might be politically relevant to Kurds and Armenians today?
Okay. So yeah, well, I can answer this at two different levels. One would be more abstract, one would be more, concrete. The more abstract part is that, well, it's to humanize Kurds. And humanizing doesn't mean that giving them a positive face at every, instant of their past. Humanizing means showing their complexity. And the colonial logic or the colonial renditions of Kurdish subjectivity is based on simplification, is based on binaries, is based on dichotomies. But once you go beyond these like really dichotomous renderings of Kurdish society, what you see is that you humanize them. You show the complexity. You show that they were, at any given time, they had many choices and they made conscious choices, and sometimes they did not. And I think it is kind of like really important to show that messiness, that complexity, to challenge that contemporary image of Kurds as unidimensional, as passive, which is very dominant in all nation-state historiographies that Kurds currently have to deal with. And the second thing is that complexity also have argument about complexity has immediate repercussions for understanding Kurdish politics right now, because Kurdish politics, we tend to homogenize actors, we tend to homogenize positionalities, and we tend to ignore what the larger segments of the Kurdish society think about these things. We underestimate their opinion, we underestimate their power. So showing that complexity has so many implications in terms of understanding, or at least having us ask this question: what do the Kurds think right now, beyond what we see, at the surface as political actors? So the complexity matters there. But for the Armenians too, it is like, it's a very, complex situation right now, because Kurdish municipalities took so many concrete efforts to basically recognize the role of the Kurds during the Armenian genocide. And the moment that it happened, the moment that the Kurdish politics opened up to, coming to terms with its past from a very proactive point of view, that corresponds with the incredible military destruction that came from the Turkish state. So talking about that messy history and being really willing to, acknowledge what happened has so many ramifications for understanding this diverse trajectories of Kurds and Armenians at the present.
Thank you very much. Do we have time for any more? Or?
We have 2 minutes, so I mean, a very quick one, or we wrap it up. If you have a final, very quick question or comment, Beshara?
Well, no, I would rather that Nilay gets a chance to sort of talk about what we didn't ask, something she wants to leave us with.
We talked so many things about so many things here, about Kurdish elites, Ottoman history, Kurdish society, and all of that. But for me, I really emphasize this. We still, when we think of the Kurds, we think of them as a monolithic group. We tend to think of them as a monolithic group represented by their elites per se, and not all the elites, and just specific elites, major elites that we know more about. So I really my larger scholarship has an issue with that. I just want to, see Kurds as complex historical actors, and they are sometimes in alliance with the state surrounding them. They are laborers. Sometimes they have problems with the communities around them. So I really emphasize this methodological aspect of my scholarship here. We can't get to the complexity of Kurdish society without deploying some form of social history perspective. So I can't help but emphasize this. Beshara's scholarship has such a big impact on my thinking of Kurdish history in terms of social history, in terms of going beyond the nation and nationalist perspective. So it is, but for the Kurdish history, this discussion is a little bit lagging behind the general patterns in Ottoman and Middle Eastern historiography. So now it's time to show the complexity of Kurdish history and Kurdistan's history.
Wonderful. I think that's a really point to conclude this conversation, although we could, of course, go on for a long time. Thanks so much, Nilay, for joining us, and many thanks, Beshara, as well. And I'd also like to thank our audience who joined us either in the webinar or on YouTube. And of course, thanks to Barbara Oberkötter, Alisa Holstein, and Alexander Laferriere who supported us. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.